It was a quiet afternoon in a small American town when Sarah Cole pushed open the door to the gun store. The little bell above the entrance gave a light jingle, but no one really looked up at first. The shop smelled of gun oil and old wood, and the walls were filled with rifles, scopes, and military memorabilia. Behind the counter, 3 men were talking loudly, laughing about something that had happened at the shooting range that morning. Sarah looked different from the usual crowd. She wasn't dressed like a hunter or a soldier. She wore simple jeans, dusty boots, and a gray jacket that had seen better days. Her hair was tied back neatly, her face calm, her eyes sharp and quiet. She didn't look nervous, but she also didn't look like she belonged. The laughter behind the counter slowed down a little as she walked in. "Afternoon, miss," one of the clerks said with a grin. "Looking for something small for self-defense?" Sarah's voice was steady when she replied, "No, I'm looking for an M24 rifle. Bolt action, long range." The laughter started again. The clerk raised an eyebrow and said, "You sure you don't mean a .22, sweetheart? That M24's a bit of a beast." The other men chuckled, shaking their heads. One whispered to another, "Must have seen it in a movie." Sarah didn't react. She just stepped closer to the display wall, scanning the rifles one by one, her fingers brushing lightly against the barrels as if she was greeting old friends. There was a confidence in the way she moved, calm, measured, and sure. The oldest man in the shop, the owner, noticed it. He had been in the Marines decades ago and had seen plenty of people come and go through his store, rookies, hunters, soldiers. Something about this woman made him pause. Her eyes didn't dart around nervously like a beginner's would. They focused. She was studying, not browsing. The younger clerk laughed again, trying to lighten the moment. "Tell you what, miss, that M24 you're asking for isn't exactly something people buy for target shooting. What are you planning to hunt?" "Tanks." Sarah gave a small smile, polite but distant. "Just targets," she said softly. The room went quiet for a few seconds. There was something in her tone. Not arrogance, not attitude, just confidence that came from experience. The men exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. One of them shrugged and finally handed her the rifle she had asked for. She lifted it gently, her hands firm but careful. She checked the chamber, the bolt, and the scope mount. Then, without saying a word, she began to field strip it right there on the counter. Her hands moved quickly. One piece after another came apart in a smooth rhythm. The men watched in surprise. It was something only trained shooters could do, and even then, few could do it with such precision. The laughter faded. When she finished, she reassembled the rifle just as fast, locked the bolt, and looked through the scope once. She adjusted the focus slightly and handed it back. "You should clean the bolt more often," she said calmly. "It's starting to stick." No one spoke. The young clerk who had been mocking her blinked and said, You've handled one of these before?" Sarah just smiled faintly. "Once or twice." There was something haunting about her smile, not prideful but tired, like someone who had lived through too much to care about being right or wrong in a gun shop. The store owner cleared his throat. "Range is open out back if you want to test it," he said quietly. She nodded. "I will." As she turned and walked toward the door leading to the shooting range, the men looked at each other again. One of them muttered, "Who is she?" The other shrugged. "Probably just another wannabe." But even he didn't sound so sure anymore. Outside, the wind picked up a bit. The range stretched behind the store, a wide open space surrounded by hills. Sarah laid the rifle down on the bench, adjusted the bipod, and checked the wind direction by tossing a small pinch of dust into the air. Her movements were fluid, practiced, the kind that came from years of muscle memory, not from reading manuals or watching tutorials. Inside the shop, the men stood by the window watching her through the glass. One of them smirked and said, "All right, let's see if she can even hit the paper." Sarah took her position. She adjusted the scope, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. She took one deep breath and exhaled slowly. Then came the shot. The sound cracked through the air, sharp and controlled. A second later, the range monitor beeped, showing a perfect bullseye. The men blinked. The second shot followed, another bullseye. then a third, then a fourth. By the fifth shot, nobody was laughing anymore. The store owner, the old Marine, stepped forward slowly, staring out the window. He whispered under his breath, "That's no amateur." Inside, the room that had once been filled with laughter was now silent. The kind of silence that comes only when pride meets truth. Sarah finished her shots, unloaded the rifle, and walked back in quietly. She didn't look proud. She didn't gloat. She just placed the rifle back on the counter and said, "You've got a good piece here. It just needs care." And with that, she turned to leave. As the bell above the door rang again, one of the clerks said in a low voice, "What was that?" The store owner only shook his head. "Someone who knows more than all of us put together." They watched her walk away, the afternoon light following her out the door. None of them knew yet that this quiet, polite woman was someone the army once called the widow, the most precise sniper they'd ever trained. But soon they would. The next day, the story of the quiet woman at the gun store had already started spreading around town. Some of the men who had laughed at her were still talking about her shooting, trying to make sense of what they saw. A few said it was luck, others said the scope was too easy, and one of them insisted she must have been using custom ammo. But deep down, everyone who watched her shoot that day knew it wasn't luck. It was skill, the kind that comes from long, lonely training, not a casual hobby. That morning, Sarah Cole walked back into the same gun store. The little bell above the door rang again, and this time, the laughter died quickly. The same men were there, the same faces that had smirked at her the day before. Now they just stared quietly. She walked up to the counter and said, "I'd like to use the range again." The young clerk, the one who had joked the loudest yesterday, tried to speak but only managed a nervous, "Sure thing." He handed her the key to the range gate, avoiding eye contact. Sarah nodded politely and walked past them toward the back. The moment she disappeared outside, the men started whispering again, but this time it wasn't with mockery. "She was hitting dead center from 700 yards yesterday," one said. "I saw it myself." Another replied, "Yeah, but who is she? You don't just pick up an M24 and shoot like that. That's military precision." The store owner, old Mr. Daniels, said nothing. He had seen that kind of skill before, during his time in the Marines when he trained with snipers overseas. There was something familiar about the way she handled the rifle, something that made his gut tighten with curiosity and respect. Outside, Sarah set up again at the long-distance range. She didn't rush. She cleaned the barrel first, checked the wind, adjusted her scope, and set down a small notepad beside her. She didn't need it, her calculations were already in her head, but she liked keeping her old habits alive. She wrote down numbers quietly, wind speed, distance, and angle. Every detail mattered. One of the men from inside walked out to watch. He tried to act casual, leaning on the fence, but he couldn't help staring as she fired the first shot. The bullet hit the bullseye, and the faint metal ping echoed across the open field. She didn't even flinch, just reloaded and fired again. Ping. Then again. Ping. After 5 perfect hits, the man whistled softly. "That's insane," he muttered. Sarah didn't respond. She was lost in her own rhythm, the same calm focus that had once kept her alive on the battlefield. Inside the shop, more people started arriving. A few customers had heard the rumors and came to see if they were true. Through the window, they watched her shoot, their voices dropping low with awe. "That's the lady everyone was talking about," someone said. "The one who outshot all the guys here yesterday." Mr. Daniels finally spoke. "You can tell by her posture," he said quietly. "That's not just training, that's experience. You don't learn that in a weekend course." One of the veterans in the store frowned. "Think she's ex-military?" Daniels nodded slowly. "I'd bet my store on it." Outside, Sarah was packing up her things when the veteran decided to step out and talk to her. He was tall, with a faded army tattoo on his forearm. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you've got one hell of an aim. Mind if I ask where you learned that?" Sarah looked up at him. For a second, she seemed like she was about to walk away. Then she said softly, "Long time ago, different world." He smiled, trying to keep it light. You were in, weren't you? Sarah hesitated. Her eyes drifted toward the hills in the distance. Yeah, she said finally. I was. The veteran nodded respectfully. What unit? She just gave a small smile. Doesn't matter now. He didn't push. He could tell by her tone that the past she carried wasn't something to brag about. It was something that still hurt. When she walked back into the store to return the key, the crowd inside fell silent. She placed it gently on the counter. The young clerk tried to speak again. Hey, sorry for. She stopped him with a kind look. No need, she said simply. You didn't know. The way she said it made the whole room feel heavy, not with guilt, but with realization. They hadn't known who she was, what she had done, or what she had seen. To them, she was just a woman with a rifle. But now, even without knowing her story, they felt the weight behind her quiet words. Mr. Daniels finally broke the silence. Ma'am, he said respectfully, if you ever want to work here, the range is yours anytime. No charge. Sarah smiled faintly. Thank you, she said, her voice calm. But I'm not looking for work. Just peace. She turned to leave, but just before she reached the door, she paused and looked back. Take care of your rifles, she said softly. A clean weapon never fails you. Then she walked out, leaving everyone speechless once again. The laughter that once filled that gun store never returned the same way. The men who mocked her now spoke of her with quiet respect. They didn't know her past, but they could feel it. In her steady hands, her sharp aim, and the calm sadness in her eyes. That night, Mr. Daniels sat alone in his office, looking through old military records online. The curiosity wouldn't let him rest. He searched the name Sarah Cole with the keywords Army and Sniper. It didn't take long before one name stood out. Staff Sergeant Sarah Cole, U.S. Army, 160th Special Operations Support. Awarded for long-range precision marksmanship and classified rescue missions. Daniels leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. So the rumors were true. She wasn't just any soldier. She was one of the best. And the next time she walked into that gun store, no one dared to laugh again. The air was still that morning when Sarah arrived again at the gun store. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The little town was quiet, and the only sound came from the gravel crunching under her boots as she walked toward the familiar door. Inside, a few men were already gathered, pretending to browse, but everyone knew they were there for one reason: to see her shoot again. When she entered, the bell above the door gave its usual ring, and this time the room went completely silent. The same faces turned toward her, but there was no laughter now. Some nodded respectfully. Others just watched in quiet curiosity. The memory of her perfect shots still lingered in everyone's mind. Sarah greeted the store owner, Mr. Daniels, with a small smile. "Morning," she said. "Morning, Sarah," he replied, this time using her name instead of Miss. His tone carried respect. "You're here early." "I need some time at the range," she replied simply. He nodded and handed her the key without asking any questions. The younger clerk who had mocked her before stayed silent, his face slightly red with embarrassment. Outside, the range looked peaceful, stretching across the open field. The wind was soft, carrying the smell of dust and grass. Sarah set her bag down on the bench and took out the same M24 rifle she had been using. She wiped it down carefully, adjusting the scope and aligning the bipod. Her movements were quiet and smooth, like a routine she had done 1,000 times before. Inside the shop, the men slowly drifted to the window again, watching her through the glass. No one spoke. There was something strangely calming about the way she moved, patient, focused, and completely at peace with what she was doing. Then she took her position on the bench, lying prone, cheek resting gently against the rifle stock. She closed one eye and looked through the scope. Her breathing slowed down, perfectly steady. She didn't rush. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the sound cracked through the still air. A sharp, clean echo rolled across the hills. Inside the store, the men leaned closer to the window. The target camera flashed, a perfect bullseye again. One man let out a low whistle. Unbelievable, he muttered. But Sarah wasn't done. She adjusted the scope slightly and fired again. Another bullseye. Then another. 5 shots, all grouped so tightly that the holes almost touched each other. There was no excitement on her face. No pride. She just quietly reloaded, adjusted her notepad, and took another shot, this time at a target even farther away. The distance was nearly impossible for most shooters. But her bullet found the center again. The sound of each shot echoed like a rhythm, steady and sure, like she was playing an instrument only she could hear. Back inside, Mr. Daniels stood silently behind the counter, arms crossed, watching her through the glass. He had trained Marines years ago, and even the best marksman he'd seen couldn't shoot like that. Not with that calmness, that precision. He whispered to himself, "That's not practice. That's instinct." After 10 perfect shots, Sarah sat up slowly and took off her ear protection. She didn't even glance at the target. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where each bullet had landed. When she walked back toward the shop, the men straightened their posture, suddenly unsure how to act. The same people who once teased her now moved aside respectfully. She placed the rifle on the counter and said softly, "Good accuracy today." One of the men finally found the courage to speak. "Ma'am," he said, scratching the back of his neck, "if you don't mind me asking, where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah smiled faintly. "You learn a lot when your life depends on it," she replied. Her words hit the room like a quiet truth. No one dared to laugh or question her again. Mr. Daniels nodded slowly. "You've got the hand of a professional. You ever serve?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked down at the rifle, then said quietly, "A long time ago, different world." Her tone was calm, but her eyes told a different story, one filled with memories she didn't want to revisit. As she spoke, the door to the shop opened suddenly. A man in a clean suit walked in, carrying a military badge clipped to his pocket. He looked around the store until his eyes landed on Sarah. "Ma'am," he said formally, "you're Sarah Cole, correct?" Sarah frowned slightly. "Who's asking?" The man hesitated, then handed her a folded envelope. "From Colonel Reeves," he said. "He said you'd know what it means." The whole store went silent. Mr. Daniels raised an eyebrow. The man continued, "He told me to tell you. They need you." Sarah took the envelope and didn't open it right away. Her hands tightened around it for a moment, and her expression changed. The calm, peaceful look she always carried was replaced by something else, something heavier. She looked up at the man and said quietly, "Tell the colonel I'm done with that life." The man nodded once. "He said you'd say that," he replied. "But he also said, it's the same kind of situation you once swore you'd never walk away from." Then he turned and left. Everyone in the shop watched in silence. Sarah stared at the envelope in her hand for a long time, then sighed. Without saying a word, she tucked it into her jacket pocket and walked out the door. As she disappeared down the street, Mr. Daniels muttered, "Whatever that was, it's not just about shooting." The others didn't answer. They just stood there, trying to understand the quiet power of the woman they had once mocked. Outside, the wind carried the sound of a truck starting. Sarah drove away slowly, her mind racing. She had tried to leave that world behind, the missions, the orders, the endless nights waiting for a single target. But the past had found her again. And as the gun store faded behind her, she knew one thing for sure. Peace was never meant to last for people like her. Sarah sat in her small kitchen that night, staring at the unopened envelope on the table. The soft ticking of the wall clock was the only sound in the room. The paper looked ordinary, but she knew what it carried inside. Something that would pull her back into the world she had left behind years ago. Her fingers brushed over it a few times, hesitant, almost afraid. Finally, she sighed and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message typed in bold letters. "We need your eyes again. Mission priority. Red. You're the only one who can make this shot." It was signed Colonel Reeves. The name made her chest tighten. She hadn't heard from him since she left the army 5 years ago. Colonel Reeves was not just her commander. He was the man who had believed in her when no one else did. The last time she saw him, she had been in a hospital bed, recovering from a mission that had gone horribly wrong. Sarah leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. The memories came flooding in, dusty deserts, gunfire echoing through mountains, her spotter's voice whispering coordinates through the radio. She remembered the moment everything changed, when her final mission went bad and her best friend, Mark, didn't make it back. That was the day she walked away from the uniform and promised herself she would never return to that life again. But now it seemed like the past wasn't done with her. The next morning, she went back to the gun store. Mr. Daniels was surprised to see her so early. She placed the envelope on the counter and asked, "Do you know anyone still connected with the army base nearby?" Daniels frowned. "Maybe one or two guys." "Why?" She hesitated. "I just need a ride to Fort Ridge. Official business." The old Marine didn't ask more questions. He could see the change in her eyes, the same cold focus he'd seen in soldiers before they went into battle. "I'll make a call," he said quietly. An hour later, Sarah stood outside the base gates. The guards recognized her name immediately and let her through without delay. Inside, she was met by Colonel Reeves himself. Older now, his hair more gray than she remembered, but his eyes still sharp and full of command. "Cole," he said, stepping forward with a rare smile. "Didn't think I'd ever see you here again." She crossed her arms. "You shouldn't have sent for me, Colonel. I told you I was done." He nodded slowly. "I know. But I wouldn't have asked if it wasn't serious." He gestured toward a large screen on the wall. "Take a look." The screen showed a satellite image, a remote desert area surrounded by mountains. Reeves zoomed in on a group of buildings marked in red. 2 days ago, one of our recon teams got ambushed. 3 men captured, 1 critical. We know where they are, but we can't get close without losing more people. The only chance we have is 1 long-distance shot to take out their commander before they move the hostages. Sarah's jaw tightened. "You have trained snipers for that." "Why me?" Reeves met her eyes. "Because it's over 2 miles out, in shifting wind, from a position only you've ever used successfully. You're the only one who's made that kind of shot in real conditions." She stared at the screen, her heart heavy. "I left for a reason, Colonel." "I know," he said softly. "You lost people you cared about. We all did. But this," he pointed at the hostages on the map. "This is innocent lives, Sarah. Civilians. If you don't help, they won't make it." She looked away, silent. Her thoughts raced back to her last mission. The sandstorm, the shouting over the radio, the moment she fired too late to save her friend. The guilt never left her. Reeves stepped closer, his voice lower now. "You don't owe the army anything. But you always said if it meant saving lives, you'd never turn your back. That's the woman I knew. That's the sniper they called the Widow." Sarah's eyes hardened at that name. It was a name the unit gave her after her record-breaking shot, the one that ended a week-long standoff and saved dozens of soldiers. But she had hated the nickname. It reminded her of loss more than pride. She took a deep breath. "If I do this, it's 1 time only. After that, I disappear again." Reeves nodded. "That's all I'm asking." By the next morning, Sarah was at the airfield. The soldiers prepping the transport helicopter looked surprised to see her. Whispers followed her wherever she walked. Most of them had only heard stories about the woman who could hit a moving target at distances others thought impossible. She kept to herself, checking her gear carefully, her scope, her ammo, her rifle. It wasn't the same M24 she used at the gun store, but a military customized version of it, balanced perfectly for her style. Her fingers moved over it like it was part of her. As the helicopter lifted off, the base grew smaller below them. The sound of the rotors filled her ears, but her mind was already somewhere else, calculating wind drift, distance, and timing. Every part of her old training started waking up again. She looked out the window at the fading horizon. She wasn't the same person she once was. Back then, she was a soldier driven by orders. Now, she was doing this for something different, redemption. When they landed at the forward post, Colonel Reeves met her with a final briefing. "Your target's in the central building. You'll have to take the shot from Ridge 12. You'll only get 1 clean chance. After that, They'll move the hostages. Sarah nodded silently. Reeves put a hand on her shoulder. Be careful, Cole. I can't lose you again. She didn't answer. She just loaded her rifle, took a deep breath, and walked toward the ridge, her silhouette blending with the rising sun. Inside the command tent, Reeves watched her go and said quietly to himself, "They have no idea who's coming for them." For the first time in years, Sarah felt that old spark again, the sense of purpose that had once defined her. But deep inside, she also knew that every shot came with a cost. And this time, she hoped it wouldn't take more from her than she had left to give. The sun was already high when Sarah reached the base camp near the desert ridge. The air was dry and hot, and the ground shimmered with heat. The soldiers there stopped what they were doing as soon as they saw her. Some looked confused, others curious. A few whispered quietly, trying to guess who this woman was and why she had been brought to a restricted operation site. She didn't wear a uniform, only her faded jacket and jeans, but the way she walked, steady, fearless, focused, made every soldier stand a little straighter. Even without her rank, she carried the presence of someone who had seen more battles than most of them ever would. Colonel Reeves walked beside her, explaining the situation as they moved toward the command tent. "We've got a small window, Cole. The enemy commander moves between these two buildings every morning to check on the hostages. That's when we'll have our shot." Sarah listened silently, her eyes scanning the satellite images on the screen. She traced the lines on the map with her finger, measuring the distances by instinct. "Wind direction?" she asked. "Northwest," Reeves replied. "Strong at midday, weak in the morning. That's your best chance." She nodded, her mind already working through angles, humidity, bullet drop, and timing. These calculations came naturally to her, like breathing. One of the younger officers in the tent couldn't hold back his curiosity. "Sir," he said to Reeves, "with all due respect, why are we depending on her? We've got active snipers available." Reeves turned to him sharply. "Because none of them can do what she can." The officer frowned. "What makes her so different?" Sarah looked up, her voice calm but firm. "Because I've done this before. And because I don't miss." The tent went quiet. The young officer lowered his eyes, realizing his mistake. Reeves gave Sarah a small, knowing nod. A few hours later, a convoy of trucks carried her and a small team toward the ridge where she would set up. As they drove through the rough terrain, the wind picked up dust that stung her face. She stared out the window, her thoughts drifting back to the last mission she had done like this, the one that had cost her a friend. She could still remember Mark's voice over the radio, calm and steady, moments before everything went wrong. The guilt still followed her, heavy and sharp. When they arrived at the ridge, the team set up a small observation post. Sarah climbed the slope with her gear strapped to her back. She moved quietly, scanning the area through her binoculars. The ridge overlooked a wide valley, where the enemy compound sat hidden among old stone buildings. She lay down on her stomach and assembled her rifle piece by piece. Every movement was precise, practiced, and silent. She checked the scope, loaded the magazine, and adjusted her position until everything felt perfect. The soldiers nearby watched in awe. "She's like a machine," one whispered. Reeves's voice came through her earpiece. "You've got confirmation. The commander's expected to come out in 15 minutes. How's your visibility?" "Clear," Sarah replied. "No glare, minimal wind. It's good." "Copy that. Remember, one shot only." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Minutes passed. The valley was quiet, too quiet. Through her scope, she could see the buildings. A guard walking lazily near the door, another sitting by a jeep. Then movement caught her eye. A tall man wearing a tan uniform stepped out, surrounded by two others. He was checking his tablet, barking orders, not realizing that he had just stepped into the view of the deadliest sniper alive. Her finger rested gently on the trigger, but she didn't rush. She waited for him to stop walking. Every tiny detail mattered. The direction of the wind, the heartbeat in her chest, the rise and fall of her breath. Reeves's voice came again, tense but calm. "That's him, Sarah. Confirm and fire when ready. She exhaled slowly, blocking out every sound, every thought. The world narrowed to the small circle of her scope. For a few seconds, everything went silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Then she squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked back softly against her shoulder. A fraction of a second later, the sound of impact reached them. Through the scope, she saw the man drop instantly. His guards panicked, shouting orders, running for cover. "Target down," she said quietly. Reeves's voice came through, filled with relief. "Good shot, Cole. Hostage team, move in." Within moments, the rescue team advanced, storming the compound. Gunfire erupted briefly, then silence returned. Over the radio came the words everyone was waiting for. "Hostages secured. All alive." Sarah finally lowered her rifle and sat up. She didn't smile, didn't cheer. She just looked out at the valley for a moment, watching the dust rise as the rescue team drove out with the survivors. The young officer from earlier climbed up the ridge, his face full of amazement. "That shot," he whispered. "That was nearly 2 miles away." Sarah nodded. 1 mile, 860 yards, she corrected softly. He looked at her with new respect. "How did you even calculate that?" She smiled faintly. "Experience. And a bit of wind." When she walked back to the camp, Reeves was waiting. He gave her a proud nod. "You did it again," he said. She shook her head. "We did it. The team did." Reeves looked at her closely. "You could come back, you know. Train others. You still have it." Sarah looked down at her rifle, then out at the desert. "No, Colonel. I did what I needed to. That's enough for me." He didn't push her further. He knew she wasn't a woman who chased glory. She only answered when something inside her demanded it. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Sarah packed up her rifle and walked away from the ridge. The mission was over, but deep down, she knew her connection to that life would never truly end. Somewhere inside, she still carried both the burden and the pride of what she had done. A quiet hero, unseen and uncelebrated, who once again proved that true strength doesn't need to shout. It only needs one perfect shot. The night after the mission, the base was alive with celebration. Soldiers were laughing, music played softly from one of the tents, and a feeling of relief filled the air. The hostages had been saved, the enemy commander was down, and no one from their team had been hurt. For most of them, it was a victory they would remember for the rest of their lives. But Sarah didn't join the celebration. She sat alone near the edge of the camp, a cup of coffee in her hands, staring at the quiet desert under the stars. The night wind was cold now, brushing against her face. She liked it that way, silence, peace, and distance from noise. That was where she always found herself after a mission, somewhere between pride and emptiness. Colonel Reeves noticed her sitting alone and walked over with 2 mugs of coffee. "You always disappear after a win," he said, handing her one. She smiled faintly. "You know I'm not much for parties." Reeves sat beside her. "You did something great today, Sarah. The hostages, they had families. You gave them back their lives." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes still on the horizon. "Maybe, but I also took one." Reeves sighed. "You took down a man who was ready to execute innocent people. You did your job. You saved lives." She didn't reply right away. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "how many lives we change without even knowing it? Good or bad?" Reeves looked at her, understanding her words more than she realized. "That's the cost of what we do," he said quietly. "But not everyone can carry it. You can." She glanced at him. "It's not strength, Colonel. It's just memory. And you can't ever put it down." The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of dust and metal. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The sound reminded her of the nights during her early missions. Young, nervous, yet determined. Now she was older, calmer, but that same fire still burned inside her. As she finished her coffee, one of the young officers from earlier came running toward them. He stopped, saluted quickly, and said, "Ma'am, sir, there's someone here asking for you, Cole." Sarah frowned. "For me? Who?" Before the officer could answer, a tall figure appeared from the shadows. It was Commander Harris, one of the highest-ranking officers in the region. His face was serious, but his tone carried deep respect. "Sarah Cole," he said firmly, "I've been trying to reach you for days. I came to thank you personally." Sarah stood, surprised. "Thank me? Sir, I just helped with—" "You didn't just help," Harris interrupted. "That shot changed the course of our operation. You saved 15 lives. And you stopped a man we've been after for 3 years." The soldiers nearby went silent, realizing who was speaking. The commander, a man known for his strict discipline, rarely showed emotion. But right now, there was something almost soft in his eyes. He took a step closer. "I owe you," he said. "And not just me, the whole unit does." Sarah didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to praise, especially from someone like him. "Sir, I only did what was needed." Harris nodded. "That's what makes you special. Most people need orders. You act when the world stands still." For a moment, no one said anything. Then Harris added, "There's something else. We need your help again." Reeves looked up sharply. "Again? She just finished a mission." "I know," Harris replied. "But this one's different. Our new team is struggling with sniper coordination. We need someone to train them. Someone who understands patience, precision, and heart. I want Sarah to lead that program." Sarah looked from Reeves to Harris. "Sir, I'm not a soldier anymore. I left that life." Harris's tone softened. "You may have left the uniform, Cole, but you didn't leave the mission. You know things that can save lives. We don't need you to fight. We need you to teach." Sarah hesitated. She had promised herself she'd never go back to that world again. But when she thought of the new recruits, young, nervous, untested, she remembered herself at their age, desperate to prove something. Maybe she could help them learn what she had to discover the hard way. Reeves placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to decide now, but think about it. You've always been more than just a sniper. You're a guide." Sarah nodded slowly. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. Harris gave her a respectful nod. "That's all I ask. We'll talk tomorrow." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing under the moonlight. When he was gone, Reeves chuckled softly. "Looks like the army still can't let you go." Sarah smirked. "Or maybe it's just trying to remind me who I am." That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her tent, listening to the hum of the generators outside and the distant laughter of the soldiers. Her mind replayed every mission, every shot, every face she had seen. Both the ones she saved and the ones she couldn't. She knew she could walk away again, disappear into the quiet life she once tried to build. But deep down, she also knew something else, that her story wasn't done yet. The stars above the desert sky seemed endless, cold, and beautiful. As she looked at them, she whispered to herself, "Maybe it's time to stop running." In that moment, Sarah realized that true strength wasn't about holding a gun or pulling a trigger. It was about knowing when to step forward, not for fame, not for glory, but to pass on what you've learned so no one else has to carry the same pain. By sunrise, her decision was made. She would stay not as a soldier but as a teacher, someone who could turn fear into focus and mistakes into lessons. The woman everyone once laughed at in a gun store was now the person the army couldn't move forward without. The next morning, the sky was painted with orange and gold as the sun rose over the desert base. Soldiers were already moving around, cleaning weapons, checking vehicles, and preparing for another long day. Sarah stood quietly near the firing range, her rifle case in one hand and a thoughtful look on her face. She had barely slept, her mind still replaying the conversation with Commander Harris from the night before. She had spent years trying to stay away from the military life, the orders, the noise, the pain that came with every mission. But deep down, she knew Harris was right. She couldn't run forever. The skills she had were rare, and the world still needed people who knew how to use them with discipline and compassion. When she reached the range, a group of young soldiers were already there, practicing with their rifles. Their shots were scattered, hitting targets unevenly. Some were frustrated, others just tired. One young recruit muttered, "I'll never get this right." Sarah watched them quietly for a few moments before stepping forward. Her voice was calm but firm. "You won't get it right if you fight your own nerves instead of the rifle." The soldiers turned, surprised. One of them whispered, "That's her. The one who made the shot yesterday." The training officer quickly came forward, saluting. "Ma'am, Commander Harris said you might come. We weren't expecting you this early." Sarah smiled faintly. "I don't like waiting around." She looked at the recruits. "Let's start." The soldiers gathered around as she set her rifle case down and opened it. Her hands moved carefully, assembling the weapon piece by piece. The way she handled it made everyone quiet. There was no rush, no wasted motion, only control and precision. "This," she said, holding the rifle up, "isn't just a weapon, it's a partner. It does exactly what you tell it to. The problem is, most people don't know what they're really saying when they pull the trigger." The recruits listened closely, their eyes fixed on her. She laid down on the ground, adjusted her scope, and took aim. Breathing controls everything. Not your hands, not your eyes. You breathe wrong, you miss. You breathe right, you hit. She fired. The bullet hit the exact center of the target, a perfect bullseye. The sound echoed across the range. One recruit blinked in disbelief. "How do you stay that steady?" Sarah looked at him. "You stop thinking about missing. You only think about doing." Over the next few hours, she moved from one soldier to another, correcting their stance, showing them how to adjust their sights, and teaching them how to calm their minds. She didn't raise her voice or boast about her skills. She spoke softly, patiently, like someone who understood fear and wanted to turn it into strength. At first, the soldiers struggled. Shots went wide, hands trembled, frustration grew. But Sarah kept her calm. "Patience," she reminded them. "You're not fighting the target. You're fighting yourself." By midday, something began to change. The soldiers started hitting closer to the center. Their breathing slowed, their focus sharpened. Sarah could see it, the moment when confidence started to replace doubt. Commander Harris and Colonel Reeves watched from a distance. Reeves smiled proudly. "Look at them. They're focused for the first time in weeks." Harris nodded. "She doesn't just train them to shoot. She trains them to think. That's rare." At one point, a young soldier named Brooks, barely 20, asked her, "Ma'am, how do you handle the pressure? The thought that if you miss, someone might die." Sarah paused. The question hit deep. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You accept it. Every shot means something. You don't fear it, but you respect it. You don't shoot for glory, you shoot to protect. That's the difference between a soldier and a killer." Brooks nodded, his eyes wide with understanding. Later that afternoon, Sarah decided to show them one last lesson. She pointed at a distant target nearly 2 kilometers away, a shot so long that even the instructors looked uncertain. "This," she said, "is what patience looks like." She lay down again, adjusted her scope, and waited. The wind shifted slightly, and she made a tiny correction. She closed one eye, took a deep breath, and pulled the trigger. The bullet hit dead center. The range went completely silent for a moment. Then the recruits erupted in awe. "Unbelievable!" one shouted. "That's impossible!" Sarah stood up, brushed off the dust, and simply said, "Nothing's impossible. You just have to respect the distance." For the rest of the day, she stayed with them, helping each soldier take their own long-range shots. When one finally hit close to the center, she smiled and said, "Now you understand." By evening, the range was quiet again. The recruits left, tired but inspired. They had learned more in one day with her than in weeks of training. Reeves walked up to her as she packed her rifle. "So," he said with a grin, "does this mean you're staying?" Sarah smiled softly. "Maybe for a while." He nodded. "They need someone like you." She looked out at the sunset, the sky glowing with deep shades of red and gold. "They don't need me," she said. "They just need someone to believe they can do it." As she walked away, the young recruits watched her leave, whispering among themselves. To them, She was no longer just a mysterious woman or a legendary sniper. She was a teacher, someone who showed them what real strength looked like. That night, Sarah sat alone again, looking up at the stars. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. She realized that this was where she belonged, not in the shadows of war, but in the light of teaching others how to fight with purpose and heart. The woman they once laughed at in a gun store had now become the soldier every commander respected, and the mentor every young fighter wished to learn from. Weeks passed, and the base had changed completely. The young soldiers who once missed their targets now shot with confidence. The training grounds echoed with the sound of precise, controlled fire. Not chaos, not panic. Every bullet hit with purpose. And in the middle of it all stood Sarah, calm and focused, guiding them like a patient guardian. She had become something more than a trainer. Soldiers came to her not just to learn how to shoot, but how to think, how to trust themselves under pressure. Her name began to spread quietly through the ranks. The woman who never misses, the one who teaches you not to fear the shot. One afternoon, Commander Harris called her to his office. When she arrived, he was looking at a large digital map, showing several red zones flashing on the screen. The tension in the air told her something was wrong. "Another situation?" she asked, standing beside him. Harris nodded. "Worse than before. A convoy of medical aid workers has been taken hostage in the Northern Valley. They're running out of time." Sarah's expression hardened. "How many?" "8 civilians. No soldiers. We tried sending a drone, but they're heavily guarded and well hidden. We can't risk a full assault without losing lives." She looked closely at the map, tracing the mountain paths with her finger. "What's your plan?" Harris sighed. "That's the thing. We don't have one. The only way we could get a clean shot is from this ridge." He pointed at the highest point on the map. "But no one's ever made a hit from that far." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "How far?" 2 miles, almost exactly." She didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then she gave a small nod. "Set up the spotter team. I'll do it." Harris looked at her, half in disbelief. "Sarah, that's an impossible shot. The wind currents up there change every few seconds. Even you." She cut him off gently. "You said it yourself once, nothing's impossible. You just have to respect the distance." The room went silent. Harris finally smiled faintly. "All right, I'll get the team ready." That evening, Sarah climbed the rocky ridge with a small unit. The sun was setting, throwing long shadows over the valley. The air grew colder, thinner, and the wind howled across the rocks. But she didn't slow down. Every step was steady. When they reached the top, she set up her rifle, adjusted her scope, and checked her gear. Her spotter, the young recruit Brooks, the same one she had trained weeks ago, was beside her, nervous but ready. "Are you sure you can do this, ma'am?" he asked quietly. Sarah smiled a little. "You were the one who said you'd trust my shot, remember?" Brooks nodded, gripping his binoculars tighter. "Yes, ma'am." Through her scope, Sarah could see the small building far below. The hostages were inside. Guards were moving around the perimeter. The distance was incredible, almost unreal. But Sarah's heartbeat stayed calm. She focused only on the details: wind direction, temperature, humidity, and the curve of the terrain. The radio crackled. Harris's voice came through. "We're counting on you, Cole. You're our only chance." Sarah replied quietly, "Understood." Minutes passed as she adjusted the scope again and again. She took a deep breath, waiting for the wind to settle. Through the lens, she spotted the leader, a tall man in dark clothes, standing near the doorway. He was shouting orders, his weapon hanging loosely by his side. That was her target. Brooks watched the wind gauge. "Winds shifting to the east," he whispered. Sarah nodded, adjusted slightly, and exhaled. For a moment, everything went completely still. The wind, her breathing, her thoughts. Then she squeezed the trigger. The sound echoed faintly. A second later, Brooks gasped. "Hit! Direct hit!" Down below, the leader dropped instantly. The other guards panicked, running for cover. The radio came alive again. "Target neutralized." Hostages secure. Repeat. Hostages secure. Brooks stared at her, eyes wide. That was the farthest shot ever recorded in the field, ma'am. You just made history. Sarah didn't smile. She only looked through the scope again, confirming that the hostages were being rescued. Then she said softly, "It's not about records. It's about bringing them home." When they returned to the base that night, everyone gathered to cheer her. Even the toughest soldiers clapped and saluted as she walked past. The same woman they once mocked in a gun store was now a legend. The sniper who saved lives from miles away, not for fame, but for duty. Commander Harris met her near the command tent. "You've done more than anyone expected," he said. "You've given these soldiers something to believe in again." Sarah looked at him and replied, "Belief is the strongest weapon, sir. Stronger than bullets." He smiled. "So what's next for you, Cole?" She looked toward the mountains, where the stars were beginning to appear. "I'll keep teaching," she said quietly, "until they don't need me anymore." The next morning, Sarah stood once more at the firing range. The young recruits lined up, waiting for her instructions. The same woman who had once been laughed at now commanded silence and respect with just her presence. She looked at them, her voice calm but firm. "Don't train to be the best. Train to be the one who never gives up. The rifle listens to your heart, so make sure your heart's in the right place." They nodded, hanging on to every word. As the sun rose higher, Sarah watched them fire one by one. Each shot rang out steady and confident. A smile formed on her face, not one of pride, but of peace. She had found her purpose again, not as a soldier or a hero, but as a teacher, someone who turned pain into wisdom and mistakes into lessons. In the end, she didn't need medals or recognition. The true reward was seeing others carry her lessons forward. The woman who once stood alone in a gun store, laughed at and underestimated, had become a symbol of quiet strength. Proof that sometimes, the ones the world doubts the most are the ones who end up saving it.